The woman appeared at the foot of the bed just after midnight. Mary Jane Heaster woke to the scent of lilacs and winter earth, though no flowers bloomed in January, and the windows were sealed against the Greenbrier cold. The figure stood motionless in the darkness of the West Virginia farmhouse, draped in the same white dress she had worn on her wedding day only months before. Her neck bent at an angle no living spine could hold. Mary Jane did not scream. She had been expecting this visit since the day they buried her daughter. Zona Heaster Shue had died on a cold morning in late January of 1807, found lifeless in her home by a neighbour boy sent to fetch eggs. The doctor ruled it natural causes. The husband wept. The town whispered, and Mary Jane knew, with the certainty that only a mother can possess, that her daughter had been murdered, but knowing and proving were separated by the width of a grave and the silence of the dead. So she prayed. She prayed for 4 weeks, kneeling on the frozen ground where Zona lay beneath the earth, asking God to send her child back with the truth. And on the 28th night, her prayer was answered. The ghost came not once but 4 times, each visit longer than the last, speaking in a voice like wind through winter branches, telling her mother how she died and who had killed her. Chapter 1. The Stillness Before. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever hour finds you listening to these words, I hope you have found a moment of quietness. Perhaps you are settling into bed as the day releases its hold, or perhaps you are in that strange hour between waking and sleep when the mind drifts most easily through time. I wonder where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Before we begin our journey backward into history, if you find value in these whispered tales from the past, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Let us become companions in the darkness, you and I, as we explore the forgotten corridors of human memory. Now, let the world grow small around you. Let the sounds of your present fade like candle smoke. We are going back to the winter of 1897, to the cold hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, where the Allegheny Mountains rose like the spine of some ancient sleeping creature, and where the people who lived among those ridges knew that the land held secrets older than memory. This is a story about death, about love, about the terrible things that can happen behind closed doors when the world is not watching. But more than that, it is a story about a ghost who returned from beyond the veil to speak a truth that the living could not utter. It is a story that changed the law, that tested the boundaries between faith and reason, and that reminds us that some voices will not be silenced, even by the grave. The Heaster family had lived in Greenbrier County for generations, their roots deep in the red clay and limestone of those West Virginia hills. They were farming people, God-fearing and hard-working, the kind of folk who measured their lives by the seasons and the harvest, by births and marriages and the slow accumulation of years. Mary Jane Robinson had married Jacob Heaster when she was young, and together they had raised their children in a 2-story farmhouse that sat in a hollow where the wind came down from the mountains with the voice of something old and wild. Of all their children, none was more beloved than Elva Zona Heaster, called Zona by all who knew her. Zona was born in 1873, in the heart of the Reconstruction years when the nation was still stitching itself back together after the great wound of the Civil War. She grew up in a world that was changing, where the old ways were giving ground slowly to the new, where railroads were beginning to spider across the mountains and the isolation that had defined Appalachian life for centuries was starting to crack. But in Greenbrier County, change moved slowly, like water through limestone, and the patterns of life remained much as they had been for generations. Zona learned to card wool and churn butter, to tend chickens and preserve food for the winter, to read the Bible and sing hymns in the little church where her family worshipped. She was a bright girl, quick with laughter, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with the kind of beauty that turned heads when she walked through town. By the time Zona reached her 20s, she had already known heartbreak. She had fallen in love with a man who worked in the nearby town of Lewisburg, and she had borne him a child out of wedlock, a son who did not survive his first year. In the moral calculus of small-town America in the 1890s, this was a stain that did not wash clean. Zona was no longer the innocent farm girl. She was a woman who had stumbled, and in the eyes of some, that stumbling marked her forever. But Mary Jane Heaster loved her daughter with a fierceness that required no conditions, and she held Zona close through the grief of the lost child and the shame that others tried to heap upon her shoulders. In the autumn of 1876, a man came to Greenbrier County who would change the course of Zona's life and end it before the winter was through. His name was Erasmus Strebling Trout Shue, though he went by Trout to most who knew him. He was not from the mountains. He had been born in Droop Mountain, not far distant, but he had lived a wandering life, working as a blacksmith and a drifter, moving from town to town with the restlessness of a man who could not settle. He was older than Zona by a decade, a stocky man with dark hair and a moustache, with hands made strong by years of working iron and a manner that could be charming when he chose. He had been married before, twice in fact, though the details of those marriages were hazy, and he did not speak of them much. One wife had died, or so he said, the other had divorced him, or perhaps he had left her. The stories shifted depending on who was telling them. Trout Shue arrived in the little community of Livesey's Mill in October, taking work as a blacksmith at the shop near the road that wound through the valley. It was there that he met Zona Heaster. She was working at the time in the home of a local family, doing domestic work to earn her keep, and she would pass by the smithy on her way to and from the house. Trout noticed her. He began to speak to her when she walked by, small pleasantries at first, then longer conversations. He was attentive in a way that few men had been to Zona since her fall from grace. He did not seem to judge her for her past. He made her laugh. Within weeks, he was courting her with an intensity that surprised even those who knew him. Mary Jane Heaster did not trust Erasmus Shue. There was something in his eyes that troubled her, something in the way he looked at her daughter that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She could not name the feeling, and he could not point to any specific thing he'd said or done, but a mother knows. She told Zona to be careful. She told her that a man who had been married twice before and who spoke so little of his past was a man who carried secrets. But Zona was 23 years old, and she was lonely. And she was tired of being the woman whom others pitied or whispered about. Trout Shue made her feel wanted. He made her feel like she could start again, like the past could be buried and forgotten. And so when he asked her to marry him in late October, only weeks after they had met, she said yes. They were married on October 20th, 1806, in a small ceremony that Mary Jane attended with a heavy heart. There was no grand celebration, no gathering of family and friends to toast the union. It was a quiet affair, the kind of wedding that happens when people are in a hurry or when they know that not everyone approves. After the ceremony, Trout took his new bride to a small house he had rented near Livesey's Mill, a modest wooden structure that sat by itself on a rise overlooking the valley. It was not much of a home, but it was theirs, and Zona set about making it a place where they could build a life together. The first weeks of the marriage seemed happy enough, at least from the outside. Zona visited her mother a few times, always with Trout by her side, and she spoke of her new life with the tentative hope of someone who wants desperately to believe that things will be all right. But Mary Jane noticed things. She noticed that Trout did not like Zona to go anywhere without him. She noticed that he answered questions meant for Zona, that he stood close to her in a way that felt less like affection and more like guarding. She noticed the way Zona's smile sometimes faltered when she thought no one was watching. As November turned to December and the cold came down from the mountains in earnest, Zona's visits to her mother's house became less frequent. When Mary Jane asked to come see her daughter, Trout always had a reason why it was not a good time. Zona was tired. Zona was not feeling well. Zona was busy with chores. The excuses piled up like snow against a door. And then, after Christmas, the visits stopped altogether. Mary Jane sent messages. She asked neighbours to check on her daughter. But Trout Shue always met them at the door with a smile and an assurance that Zona was fine, that she was simply resting, that she would come visit soon. The winter of 1897 was cold in Greenbrier County, the kind of cold that made the ground ring like iron and turned breath to frost in the air. The mountains wore their snow like a shroud, and the bare trees stood black against the white hillsides. In the little house near Livesey's mill, Zona Heaster Shue went about the business of being a wife to a man she barely knew. She cooked his meals and mended his clothes, and kept the fire burning in the stove. She lay beside him in the dark and listened to the wind howling down from the ridge. And she waited, though she could not have said what she was waiting for. On the morning of January the 23rd, 1807, a Saturday, the world was locked in winter's grip. Ice hung from the eaves of the little house. The sky was the colour of old pewter. Trout Shue had work to do that morning, errands to run in the nearby town, and he left early, telling Zona he would be back by midday. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, her shawl wrapped tight against the cold. That was the last time anyone would see Zona Heaster Shue alive. What happened in those hours between Trout's leaving and the moment when death came to that house no living person witnessed? There were no neighbours close enough to hear a cry. There were no travellers on the road who might have seen something amiss. There was only the house and the cold and whatever passed between husband and wife in the privacy of walls that have never learned to speak. But walls remember, even when tongues are silent. Floorboards hold the weight of what has happened upon them. And in Greenbrier County, in the winter of 1897, the dead were about to learn how to testify. Chapter 2. A Marriage in the Mountains. The courtship of Zona Heaster and Erasmus Trout. Shue had been brief, burning with the kind of intensity that can either forge a bond strong enough to last a lifetime or consume everything it touches and leave only ash. In the autumn of 1896, when the leaves were turning gold and red on the mountain slopes and the air carried the sharp scent of coming winter, Trout had pursued Zona with a single-minded determination that some found romantic and others found unsettling. He brought her small gifts, trinkets from the general store, ribbons for her hair. He walked her home from church on Sundays. He stood outside the house where she worked, waiting for her to finish her day's labour so that he might walk beside her for a few precious moments. To understand what drew Zona to this man requires understanding what her life had become after the loss of her child and the abandonment by the father of that child. In the tight-knit communities of Appalachia, reputation was everything. A woman who had fallen, as the saying went, found that the world became a smaller and colder place. Doors that had once been open to her were now closed. Young men who might have courted her found reasons to look elsewhere. She was still welcomed at church, for the gospel taught forgiveness, but she felt the weight of judgment in the glances that lingered a moment too long, in the conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She was lonely in a way that hollowed out the heart. Trout Shue did not seem to care about any of that. He told Zona that the past was the past, that what mattered was the future they could build together. He spoke of the home they would have, of the children they might raise, of growing old together in these mountains where both of them had been born. He was not a wealthy man, but he had a trade and he worked hard when the mood took him. He could provide for her, keep a roof over her head, put food on the table. In 1896, for a woman in Zona's position, these were not small promises. Mary Jane Heaster watched her daughter fall under Trout Shue's spell with increasing alarm. She had met the man only a handful of times, but each encounter had deepened her distrust. There was something performed about his charm, something that reminded her of an actor reciting lines rather than a man speaking from the heart. He was always too quick with a compliment, too eager to please, and beneath that surface pleasantness she sensed something harder and colder. She tried to voice her concerns to Zona, choosing her words carefully so as not to push her daughter away, but Zona would not hear it. She was tired of being alone. She was tired of being the object of pity. Trout Shue wanted her, and that wanting felt like redemption. The wedding took place on October the 20th in the home of a local justice of the peace. It was a Wednesday, an unusual day for a wedding, but Trout had insisted they not wait for the weekend. There were no bridesmaids, no groomsmen, no gathering of family to witness the union. Jacob Heaster stood beside his wife, his weathered face betraying nothing, but his hand gripped Mary Jane's with a pressure that spoke volumes. Zona wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, practical for the season, with a white collar that she had stitched herself. Trout wore his Sunday suit, brushed clean of soot from the forge. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Afterward, there was no celebration, no wedding supper, no music or dancing. Trout took his bride to their new home as the afternoon light was already fading from the sky. The house Trout had rented sat on the road between Livesey's Mill and Richlands, two small communities that barely qualified for the name. It was a modest structure, wood frame with a stone chimney, 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above reached by a narrow stair. The front room served as kitchen and parlour both, with a cast iron stove for cooking and heating. The back room held a bed and a wardrobe and little else. There was a well in the yard and an outhouse behind the property. By the standards of rural West Virginia, it was adequate, neither grand nor destitute, the kind of place where thousands of young couples had begun their married lives and where many had found happiness or at least contentment. Zona set about making the house a home. She hung curtains in the windows, thin fabric that let in the light but provided some privacy from the road. She scrubbed the floors and swept out the corners where dust and spiders had accumulated during the house's vacancy. She arranged the few pieces of furniture they owned, moving the table to catch the morning sun, positioning the chairs so that 2 people might sit together in the evening by lamplight. She brought with her a few precious possessions from her childhood home: a quilt her grandmother had made, a wooden box that held her mother's recipes written in careful script, a small Bible that had been a gift at her confirmation. Trout went to work each day at the blacksmith shop, returning home in the evenings with his clothes smelling of smoke and hot metal, his hands blackened despite the scrubbing he gave them at the pump outside. He expected his supper to be ready when he arrived, the house to be clean, his shirts to be washed and mended. These were the ordinary expectations of the time, the division of labour that governed nearly every marriage in America. And Zona had been raised to fulfill such duties. She cooked the meals her mother had taught her to make. Hearty country food built around whatever was available: beans and corn bread, fried potatoes and onions, chicken when they could afford it, pork belly salted and stored in the cellar. In those early weeks of marriage, there were moments when Zona allowed herself to believe that she had made the right choice. Trout could be tender when he wanted to be. He sometimes brought her small surprises: a length of ribbon from town, a peppermint stick from the general store. He told her she was pretty, that he was lucky to have her, that they would make a good life together. But there were other moments, darker ones, when his mood would shift without warning, and the air in the small house would grow thick with tension. He did not like her to question him about where he had been or what he had done. He did not like her to mention her past even in the most innocent way. He did not like her mother to visit. Mary Jane tried. She sent word that she would like to come see her daughter, to bring her some preserves and a loaf of bread and simply sit with her for an hour. But when she arrived at the little house, Trout always seemed to be there, always managing to insert himself into the visit, always steering the conversation away from anything Mary Jane might have wanted to discuss with her daughter alone. He was unfailingly polite to his mother-in-law, offering her tea, inquiring about her health and that of her husband. But his presence was a wall that prevented any real intimacy between mother and daughter. After an hour or so, he would glance at the clock and mention that he and Zona had chores to attend to, and Mary Jane would find herself being ushered toward the door, with thanks for her visit and assurances that they would come see her soon. As November deepened, the first snows began to dust the mountains, Zona's letters to her mother became less frequent. When they did come, they were brief and strangely formal, as though written with someone looking over her shoulder. She wrote of the weather, of small domestic tasks, of Trout's work at the forge. She did not write of her feelings. She did not write of her marriage. She did not write of whether she was happy or unhappy, content or afraid. The silences in those letters spoke louder than any words could have. By December, Mary Jane had begun to lose sleep. She would wake in the dark hours of the night with a feeling of dread pressing on her chest like a physical weight. She prayed for her daughter, long prayers whispered into the darkness, asking God to protect Zona and to give Mary Jane wisdom to know if something was truly wrong or if she was simply a worried mother seeing shadows where there were none. Jacob told her she was borrowing trouble, that young marriages always had their rough patches, that Zona was a grown woman who had made her choice and needed to be allowed to live with it. But Mary Jane could not shake the feeling that something in that little house near Livesey's mill was very wrong. Christmas came and went. The Heaster family gathered as they always did, but Zona was not among them. Trout had sent word that she was not feeling well, that travel in the cold would be too much for her, that they would visit after the new year. Mary Jane sent back a basket of food, holiday treats and preserves, along with a scarf she had knitted for her daughter. Trout sent a polite thank you note in return. Zona did not write. January of 1897 arrived with bitter cold. The wind that came down from the mountains carried ice in its teeth. Water froze in the buckets overnight. The roads became treacherous with ruts of frozen mud and patches of ice hidden beneath dust and snow. It was the kind of weather that kept people close to their fires, venturing out only when necessity demanded. In the little house where Zona and Trout Shue lived, the days took on a rhythm of isolation. Trout went to work when the weather allowed. Zona stayed home, tending the fire, preparing meals, waiting for the sound of his footsteps on the porch. What passed between them in those long winter evenings, what words were spoken or left unspoken, what tensions simmered beneath the surface of their daily routines, no one could say. Marriage is a private country with borders that outsiders cannot cross. But on the morning of January 23rd, 1897, those borders were about to be breached. Death was about to enter that house and change everything. The truth that had been hidden behind closed doors was about to demand a witness, and a mother who had prayed for her daughter's safety was about to receive an answer to her prayers in a form that would defy everything the rational world believed possible. Chapter 3. The morning she was found. The boy's name was Andy Jones, and he was 11 years old, the son of a farmer who lived about a mile down the valley from the house where Zona and Trout Shue had made their home. On the morning of January 23rd, a Saturday, Andy's mother sent him to the Shue residence on an errand. Trout Shue had stopped by the Jones farm the day before and asked if their boy might come fetch some eggs the next morning, as Trout would be going into town and Zona would be home alone. It was a common enough arrangement in those days, neighbours helping neighbours, children running small errands in exchange for a penny or a piece of candy. Andy's mother wrapped him in his warmest coat, wound a scarf around his neck, and sent him up the road with instructions to be polite and not to dawdle. The morning was bitterly cold, the kind that makes lungs ache and skin burn. Andy walked quickly, his breath pluming white in the frozen air. The road was rutted with frozen mud, and patches of old snow clung to the shadowed places where the sun could not reach. He passed the blacksmith shop where Trout worked, saw smoke rising from its chimney, though the forge was not yet fired for the day. He passed the small general store, still closed at that early hour. The valley was quiet with the particular silence that comes when cold has driven all living things into shelter. When Andy reached the Shue house, he noticed first that no smoke rose from the chimney. This struck him as odd, for even on the coldest mornings a house needed heat, and it was a wife's duty to keep the fire going. He climbed the steps to the porch, his boots heavy on the wooden planks, and knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and called out a greeting. Still nothing. He tried the door and found it unlocked. In rural communities where everyone knew everyone, and crime was rare, unlocked doors were common. But something about the silence of the house made Andy hesitate. He pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The front room was dim, the curtain still drawn against the morning light. The stove was cold, its fire long dead. The room had the chill of a place that had not been heated through the night. Andy called out again, his voice smaller now, uncertain. He moved deeper into the room, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. That was when he saw her. Zona Shue lay at the bottom of the stairs that led to the sleeping loft. She was on her back, her body stretched out straight as though she had been arranged that way, her head tilted at an angle toward the steps. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were folded across her stomach. She wore a high-necked dress, dark-coloured, with a scarf wound around her throat. She was perfectly still. Andy Jones stood frozen for a moment, his young mind trying to understand what he was seeing. He had never seen a dead person before, though he had seen animals that had died, and there was something about the absolute stillness of the woman on the floor that communicated death even to a child's inexperienced eyes. He did not go closer. He did not touch her. He turned and ran from the house as fast as his legs could carry him, his heart hammering, his breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with the cold. He ran first to the blacksmith shop, bursting through the door with enough force to startle the man inside who was just beginning to lay the fire for the day's work. The man was not Trout Shue, but another smith who sometimes worked the forge when Trout was elsewhere. Andy stammered out his story, the words tumbling over each other, about the cold house and the woman on the floor and how she was not moving at all. The blacksmith told the boy to stay put and hurried up the road toward the Shue residence. By the time the blacksmith reached the house, Trout Shue had arrived. He had been in town, or so he said, running errands, and had returned to find the door standing open and the Jones boys' tracks in the frost on the porch. He met the blacksmith at the door, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror as the other man told him what the boy had seen. They entered the house together. Trout went immediately to his wife's body. He dropped to his knees beside her, calling her name, touching her hands. The blacksmith hung back, watching, as Trout cradled Zona's head in his hands and began to sob. The grief appeared genuine, wrenching, the kind of anguish that cannot be feigned. But the blacksmith, whose name was William Gibbons, noticed something strange. He noticed that Trout's hands lingered on Zona's neck, adjusting the scarf that was wound there, smoothing it, arranging it. And he noticed that even in his grief, Trout seemed to be positioned in such a way that his body blocked most of Gibbons's view of Zona's upper body and head. Word spread quickly through the small community. In places where everyone knows everyone, tragedy becomes common property within hours. Neighbours began to arrive, women who had known Zona, men who had worked with Trout. Someone sent for the doctor. Someone else rode to the Heaster farm to inform Zona's parents. The house that had been so cold and silent when Andy Jones arrived, filled with people and noise and the awkward bustle that accompanies sudden death. Dr. George W. Knapp arrived within the hour. He was the local physician, an older man who had practiced medicine in Greenbrier County for nearly 30 years. He had delivered babies and set broken bones and sat at sick beds through countless long nights. He had signed more death certificates than he could count. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or hasty judgments. When he entered the Shue house that morning, he expected to conduct a routine examination of a woman who had likely died of natural causes. Young women did die sometimes, of heart conditions or seizures, or any of a dozen afflictions that struck without warning. It was sad but not uncommon. What he found when he tried to examine Zona's body was obstruction. Trout Shue would not leave his wife's side. He held her head in his lap, one hand supporting her neck, the other smoothing her hair. He wept and pleaded with the doctor to tell him what had happened, how his beloved wife could have been taken from him so suddenly. When Dr. Knapp asked Trout to step aside so that he might conduct a proper examination, Trout became agitated. He said his wife had been ill, that she had complained of a weakness in her limbs, that she must have fainted at the top of the stairs and fallen. He kept adjusting the scarf around her neck, kept positioning her head just so. Dr. Knapp managed a brief examination under these difficult circumstances. He noted that Zona's body was already growing stiff with the rigor mortis, suggesting she had been dead for some hours. He saw no obvious signs of violence, no blood, no visible wounds. Her face was dishevelled, almost serene. He pressed on her abdomen and felt nothing unusual. He attempted to examine her neck more closely, but Trout's constant interference made it nearly impossible. Finally, growing frustrated and feeling pressured by the crowd of onlookers who filled the small house, Dr. Knapp made his determination. He would write in his report that Zona Shue had died of an everlasting faint, a term sometimes used to describe a sudden loss of consciousness leading to death. Later, he would change this to complications from pregnancy, though he had no concrete evidence for such a diagnosis. The truth was that he had not been able to perform a thorough examination, and rather than admit this, he chose a cause of death that seemed plausible enough. As the day wore on, women from the community came to prepare Zona's body for burial, as was the custom. They would wash her, dress her in her burial clothes, and lay her out for viewing. But when they tried to perform these final kindnesses, Trout again interfered. He insisted on dressing his wife himself. He had already changed her into a high-necked dress, with a stiff collar, dark in colour, sombre and appropriate for a funeral. He had wound a large scarf around her neck, tying it in an elaborate fashion that covered her throat completely. When one of the women tried to adjust the scarf, thinking it looked odd, Trout snapped at her to leave it alone. He said Zona had always loved that scarf, that she would want to be buried in it. The woman stepped back, chastened, and the scarf remained. Mary Jane Heaster arrived at the house in the late afternoon, having travelled as quickly as the frozen roads would allow. She entered the house where her daughter had died, and found it full of strangers and acquaintances, all speaking in hushed tones, all offering condolences that sounded like distant thunder. She pushed through them to where Zona lay on the bed in the back room, now dressed and arranged for viewing. Trout stood beside the bed like a guard, his eyes red from crying, his face drawn with what appeared to be genuine devastation. Mary Jane looked at her daughter and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Zona's face was peaceful, yes, but there was something wrong about the way she lay, something unnatural about the angle of her head despite Trout's obvious efforts to position it correctly. And that scarf around her neck, that large concealing scarf, struck Mary Jane as obscene, a lie in cloth form. She reached out to touch her daughter's face, to stroke her hair one last time, and Trout moved closer, his body between Mary Jane and the bed. In that moment, Mary Jane knew with absolute certainty that her daughter had been murdered. She had no proof, no evidence that would stand in a court of law, but she knew. The knowledge settled into her bones like the cold that had been seeping into the house all day through walls and windows that could not quite keep the winter out. Her daughter had been killed, and the man weeping beside the bed was the killer, and everyone in this room was going to let him walk away because a doctor had signed a certificate and no one wanted to believe that such a thing could happen here, in their peaceful valley, among people they had known all their lives. Mary Jane said nothing. She stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, looking at Zona, memorizing every detail of her daughter's face. Then she turned and walked out of the house into the frozen afternoon. Behind her, Trout Shue continued his vigil, and the community continued to murmur its sympathies. And the truth lay wrapped in a scarf around a dead woman's throat, waiting for someone to unwrap it. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Examination. The funeral was set for January 25th, 2 days after Zona's body had been discovered. This was faster than was customary, even in an era when embalming was not yet common practice and bodies needed to be buried quickly, especially in winter, when the ground was frozen and grave digging was brutal work. Trout Shue insisted on the swift burial, saying that he could not bear to have his wife's body lying in state for long, that it pained him too much to see her that way. The community, sympathetic to his grief, did not question this request. Only Mary Jane Heaster found it suspicious, one more piece of evidence in the case she was building in her mind, though she had nowhere yet to present it. During the 2 days between death and burial, the house remained open for viewing, as was the custom. Neighbours and acquaintances came to pay their respects, to stand beside the bed where Zona lay in her high-necked dress and elaborate scarf to offer condolences to the widowed husband who kept constant vigil. Trout barely left the room. He sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, sometimes standing to adjust the pillow beneath Zona's head or to smooth the covers that lay over her body. Several women remarked on how devoted he seemed, how his grief was almost too much to witness. But others, particularly those who had known Zona, found his behaviour strange. He would not allow anyone to touch her neck or upper moor. When someone reached to adjust a strand of hair that had fallen across her face, He intercepted their hand with a gentle but firm grip and performed the task himself. Mary Jane came each day to sit with her daughter's body. She brought with her a pillowcase that she had sewn herself, intending to place it beneath Zona's head, a final gift from mother to child. When she tried to make this exchange, lifting Zona's head carefully to slip the pillow free, she felt something that made her freeze. The head moved in a way that was wrong, too loosely, as though the bones that should have held it firm were no longer properly connected. He looked up at Trout, who had been across the room but was now suddenly beside her, his hand on her shoulder, telling her gently that he would take care of it, that she should not trouble herself. Mary Jane stepped back, her heart racing, and watched as Trout repositioned Zona's head with practiced movements, adjusting the scarf, arranging everything just so. That night, Mary Jane told her husband what she had felt. Jacob Heaster listened with the patient silence of a man who'd been married long enough to know when his wife needed to speak and when she needed to be heard. When she finished, he did not dismiss her concerns, but neither did he know what to do with them. The doctor had ruled the death natural. There had been no signs of violence. Trout's grief seemed genuine. What Mary Jane was suggesting, that a man had murdered his wife in their own home and was now successfully fooling an entire community, seemed too monstrous to contemplate. And yet Jacob could not ignore the certainty in his wife's voice or the terror in her eyes. The funeral took place at the Soul Chapel Methodist Church, a small white building that sat on a rise overlooking the valley. The weather had turned slightly warmer, enough that the frozen ground had softened just enough to allow the grave to be dug. The service was brief, presided over by the local minister who spoke of God's mysterious ways and the comfort of knowing that the deceased had been a woman of faith. Zona's coffin was closed, which was unusual. Trout had insisted on it, saying he wanted people to remember his wife as she had been in life, not as a corpse in a box. Some thought this sentiment touching. Mary Jane thought it convenient. At the graveside, as the coffin was lowered into the cold earth, Trout Shue wept openly. He was supported by two men from the community, his legs seeming barely able to hold him upright. He threw a handful of dirt onto the coffin and cried out Zona's name. The performance, if performance it was, convinced most of those present that whatever else might be said about Trout Shue, he had truly loved his wife and was devastated by her loss. Mary Jane stood apart from the main group of mourners, her face set in lines that might have been grief or might have been something harder. She did not cry. She watched her daughter's coffin disappear beneath shovel after shovel of earth, and she made a decision. That night, kneeling beside her bed in the farmhouse where she had raised Zona, Mary Jane Heaster began to pray. She prayed with an intensity and specificity that would have surprised those who knew her only as a quiet, God-fearing woman who attended church regularly and kept her faith private. She prayed to God directly, without the formal language of the church, speaking as one would speak to a friend or a judge or anyone who had the power to grant what was being asked. She told God that her daughter had been murdered. She told God that the living had failed Zona, that the doctor had been fooled, or allowed himself to be fooled, that the law would not act without proof. She asked God for justice, and then she asked for something that most people would never have dared to request. She asked God to send Zona back to her, to let her daughter return from beyond death to tell the truth that she could no longer speak in life. For 3 weeks, Mary Jane prayed this prayer every night. She prayed it on her knees until her knees ached. She prayed it with her eyes closed and her hands clasped so tightly that her fingers went numb. She prayed it in the dark hours after midnight, when the house was silent and even her husband slept. She did not tell anyone what she was praying for, not even Jacob, because she knew how it would sound, but she believed with the kind of faith that moves mountains or calls the dead from their graves that God would answer her. During those same 3 weeks, life in Greenbrier County went on. Trout Shue returned to work at the blacksmith shop, though his attendance was sporadic. He would show up and work with frantic energy, pounding iron as though trying to beat something out of his system. Other times he would not appear at all, and those who went to check on him would find him sitting in the house he had shared with Zona, staring at nothing, claiming he was too overcome with grief to leave. The community continued to support him with food and visits and the kind of practical help that neighbours provide. No one suspected him of anything worse than being a man undone by loss. But there were whispers. There are always whispers in small towns. Someone recalled that Trout had been married before, twice in fact, and that both previous wives were now dead or divorced, under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Someone else mentioned that they had heard arguments coming from the Shue house in the weeks before Zona's death, voices raised in anger though the words had not been clear. A woman who had visited Zona in December said that she had seemed nervous, jumpy, that she had flinched when Trout entered the room unexpectedly. These whispers did not coalesce into anything actionable. They were just the background noise of gossip, the way communities process tragedy by examining it from every angle, looking for meaning or warning or simply something to talk about. Dr. Knapp heard some of these whispers and began to feel uneasy about the examination he'd conducted. In the days following Zona's death, he thought back on that morning, on how difficult Trout had made it to examine the body properly, on how he had allowed himself to be rushed and pressured into making a determination without being thorough. He had signed the death certificate, and that signature carried weight. If he had been wrong, if he had missed something, the consequences could be significant not just for justice, but for his own reputation. But what could he do now? The woman was buried. The case, such as it was closed. To reopen it would require admitting his own failure, and that was a difficult thing for any man to do, particularly a man whose authority depended on the community's trust in his judgment. Then, on the night of February 18th, 1897, 4 weeks after Zona's death, Mary Jane Heaster's prayers were answered. She woke in the darkness of her bedroom to find a figure standing at the foot of her bed. The figure was luminous, glowing with a soft light that did not come from any lamp or candle. The figure wore a white dress, the same dress Zona had worn on her wedding day, and the figure's head was tilted at an impossible angle, bent to one side as though the neck were broken. Mary Jane did not scream. She had been waiting for this. She sat up slowly, her husband still sleeping beside her, undisturbed. The figure began to speak, and the voice was Zona's voice, though it seemed to come from very far away, as though travelling through water or wind to reach Mary Jane's ears. The ghost told her mother that she had been murdered. She described how Trout had flown into a rage over a small matter, something about the dinner not being cooked properly, or perhaps about a comment Zona had made. In his fury, he had grabbed her by the throat and strangled her. When she fell unconscious, he had snapped her neck to be certain she was dead. Then he had dressed her in the high-necked gown and wrapped the scarf around her throat to hide the bruises and the unnatural angle of her broken neck. He had arranged her at the bottom of the stairs to make it look like a fall, and he had fooled everyone, or nearly everyone. The ghost visited Mary Jane 4 times over the following nights. Each visit brought more detail, more description of the violence that had ended her life. The ghost told her mother specific things that only someone who had been present at the murder could know. She described the room where it happened, the position of furniture, the time of day, the weather outside the windows. She told Mary Jane that her neck had been broken on the right side, that it could be rotated all the way around if someone were to try. And she told her mother to seek justice, to not let this crime go unpunished, to make sure that Trout Shue paid for what he had done. After the 4th visitation, the ghost did not return. Mary Jane spent several more nights waiting, praying, hoping for one more chance to speak with her daughter. But Zona did not come again. The message had been delivered. Now it was up to the living to act on it. Mary Jane rose from her bed on the morning after the final visitation and told her husband everything. Jacob Heaster listened with an expression that moved from skepticism to confusion to something approaching belief. He had lived with Mary Jane for 30 years. He knew her to be a sensible woman, not given to hysteria or flights of imagination. If she said she had seen their daughter's ghost, then either she truly had or something had affected her mind so deeply that she believed she had. And either way, the conviction with which she spoke demanded action. Together, they went to the prosecutor. John Alfred Preston was the prosecuting attorney for Greenbrier County, a man with political ambitions and a reputation for being thorough. When Mary Jane Heaster walked into his office and told him that her daughter had been murdered, and that the proof came from the victim herself, returned from the grave to testify, Preston did not immediately dismiss her as mad. He listened, he asked questions, he took notes, and when she finished speaking, he sat back in his chair and considered what he had heard. Preston knew that no court in America would admit ghost testimony as evidence. The law dealt in facts that could be verified, in witnesses who could be cross-examined, in physical evidence that could be presented to a jury. But Preston also knew that Mary Jane Heaster's testimony about her daughter's ghost could not be ignored entirely. If nothing else, it indicated that there were serious questions about the circumstances of Zona's death. Questions that should have been asked at the time, but had been overlooked in the rush to close the case. Preston decided to investigate. He began by interviewing Dr. Knapp, pressing him for details about the examination he had conducted. Under questioning, Knapp admitted that the examination had been hasty, that Trout Shue had interfered, that he had not been able to examine the body as thoroughly as he should have. Knapp also admitted that he had changed the cause of death on the certificate from everlasting faint to complications of pregnancy without any real evidence for either diagnosis. Preston asked if Knapp would support an exhumation and a proper autopsy. After some hesitation, conscious of how such a request would reflect on his professional competence, Knapp agreed. Preston also interviewed others who had been present at the Shue house on the day Zona's body was discovered. He spoke with the blacksmith who had arrived with young Andy Jones. He spoke with the women who had tried to prepare the body for burial. He spoke with neighbours who had seen or heard things in the weeks before Zona's death. A pattern began to emerge, a picture of a marriage that had been troubled, of a husband who was controlling and quick to anger, of a wife who had become increasingly isolated and fearful. It was not proof of murder, but it was enough to justify further investigation. On February 22, 1897, exactly 1 month after Zona had been buried, Prosecutor Preston obtained a court order for exhumation and autopsy. The grave in Soul Chapel Cemetery was opened, the coffin raised from the earth and transported to a nearby building, where Dr. Knapp and 2 other physicians would conduct the examination that should have been done on the day Zona died. Word of the exhumation spread through the community like wildfire. Some people were horrified, believing it sacrilege to disturb the dead. Others were grimly satisfied, believing that justice required such measures. And Trout Shue, when he heard the news, reportedly went pale and began to shake. Chapter 5. The Funeral of Zona Shue. The exhumation took place on a cold February morning, under a sky the colour of old iron. A small crowd had gathered at Soul Chapel Cemetery, despite efforts to keep the proceedings private. In rural communities, news travels by mysterious paths, passed from mouth to ear along the roads and at the general store, and after church services. By the time the workers arrived with their shovels to open Zona's grave, at least 24 people stood at a respectful distance, watching into silence as the earth was disturbed and the coffin slowly revealed. Trout Shue was among the watchers. He had appeared shortly after the work began, walking up the hill to the cemetery, with his hands thrust deep in his coat pockets and his hat pulled low. He stood apart from the main group of onlookers, neither speaking to anyone nor meeting anyone's eyes. Those who glanced in his direction reported that he seemed agitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his jaw working as though he were chewing words he could not or would not speak. When the coffin was finally raised from its resting place, dark with earth and moisture, Trout turned and walked away down the hill, his back rigid, his pace quickening until he was almost running. The coffin was transported to a small outbuilding near the church, a space normally used for storing tools and supplies, but cleared for this grim purpose. 3 physicians had been assembled for the autopsy. Dr. Knapp was present, though he would do little of the actual examination, his role having become more that of witness than investigator. Dr. Rupert had been brought in from a neighbouring county, a man with more training in pathology than was common among rural physicians, and the county coroner, whose name was McClung, would oversee the proceedings and document the findings. When the coffin was opened, The physicians found that Zona's body had been remarkably well preserved by the winter cold and the conditions of burial. The high-necked dress and elaborate scarf were still in place, just as Trout had arranged them a month before. The first step was to remove these garments and examine what lay beneath. As the scarf was unwound from around Zona's neck, the physicians saw immediately what Trout Shue had been so desperate to hide. The neck was discoloured with bruises, dark marks that formed clear patterns. These were not the bruises of a fall. These were the marks of fingers, of hands that had gripped with crushing force. Dr. Rupert, who had more experience with such matters than the others, took careful measurements and made detailed notes. The bruising indicated that someone had grabbed Zona from behind, the thumbs pressing into the back of the neck while the fingers wrapped around to the front, compressing the windpipe. The force required to create such marks was considerable, far beyond anything that could happen accidentally. The bruises had been hidden by the scarf, but they told a clear story of violence and intent. Then the physicians began the more invasive work of the autopsy, opening the body to examine the internal structures. What they found confirmed Mary Jane Heaster's impossible testimony. Zona's neck had been broken, the vertebrae fractured and displaced in a way that could only result from deliberate force. The windpipe was crushed, the cartilage shattered. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that is often broken in cases of strangulation, was fractured. There were other injuries as well, bruising to the internal tissues of the neck that showed a pattern consistent with manual strangulation, followed by a violent twisting or wrenching of the head. Dr. Rupert dictated his findings while McClung wrote them down in careful stilled script. The cause of death was unambiguous. Zona Heaster Shue had been strangled and her neck broken by human hands. The positioning of the injuries, the pattern of the bruising, the nature of the fractures, all pointed to murder. There was no possibility of accident, no way to explain these wounds as the result of a fall down the stairs or any other natural occurrence. Someone had killed this woman with deliberate and considerable force, and that someone had then gone to elaborate lengths to conceal the evidence of the crime. When the examination was complete, the physicians prepared a formal report for Prosecutor Preston. The report was clinical in its language, describing in medical terms what had been done to Zona's body, but the implications were clear. This was a homicide. The fact that the crime had been discovered only because a mother had insisted on investigation, driven by what she claimed were visits from her daughter's ghost, was remarkable. But the physical evidence now spoke for itself, and that evidence would stand in any court of law. Trout Shue was arrested on February 23, 1807, the day after the autopsy was completed. A deputy found him at the blacksmith shop where he had been working, or pretending to work, hammering iron with a frantic energy that those present described as manic. When the deputy informed Trout that he was under arrest for the murder of Zona Heaster Shue, Trout did not protest or claim innocence. He simply set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his apron, and asked if he could get his coat. He was taken to the county jail in Louisburg to await trial. The arrest caused a sensation throughout Greenbrier County and beyond. Newspapers in Charleston and other cities picked up the story, fascinated by the unusual circumstances of the case. A woman murdered by her husband was tragically common, but a murder discovered through the testimony of a ghost was unprecedented. Reporters descended on the small community, interviewing anyone who would talk to them, seeking details about the crime, the investigation, and especially about Mary Jane Heaster's visitations from her dead daughter. Mary Jane herself became something of a celebrity, though she did not seek or welcome the attention. She gave interviews reluctantly, always careful to present her experience with the ghost as a matter of faith rather than fantasy. She was not a spiritualist or a medium. She did not claim any special powers, she had simply prayed for help, and God had answered by allowing her daughter to return and speak the truth. Some listeners found this explanation compelling. Others dismissed it as the delusions of a grief-stricken woman who happened to stumble onto the truth by accident. But whether one believed in the ghost or not, the physical evidence was undeniable. Zona had been murdered, and Trout Shue was the only person who had the opportunity and the motive to commit that murder. In the weeks following the arrest, more of Trout Shue's history came to light. Investigators looking into his past discovered that he had indeed been married twice before. His first wife, a woman named Ali Estelline Cutlip, had divorced him in 1889, citing cruelty and abuse. She told investigators that Trout had been violently jealous, that he had beaten her on multiple occasions, and that she had feared for her life by the end of their marriage. His second wife, whose name was Lucy Ann Tritt, had died in 1895 under circumstances that now seemed suspicious. At the time, her death had been attributed to natural causes, but no thorough investigation had been conducted. Lucy's family, when contacted by authorities, said they had always suspected foul play, but had lacked evidence to pursue the matter. Now, with Zona's murder proven, questions arose about whether Trout Shue had killed before and simply been more successful at hiding it. Trout himself remained silent in jail. He refused to speak to reporters or investigators. He showed no emotions when informed of what the autopsy had revealed. His only visitor was a lawyer named Hogg, who had been appointed to defend him. The conversations between Trout and his attorney were, of course, privileged, but those who saw Hogg leaving the jail described him as looking troubled and uncertain. It was not an easy case to defend. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The defendant had no alibi, no explanation for his wife's injuries, and a history of violence toward women. The only real question was what strategy the defense would employ, and whether Trout Shue would take the stand in his own defense. The trial was scheduled for June 1897, 3 months after the arrest. This gave both sides time to prepare, though the outcome seemed almost foreordained. Prosecutor Preston planned to present the medical evidence, the testimony of those who had observed Trout's suspicious behaviour around Zona's body, and the history of his previous marriages. He would establish opportunity, means, and motive, the classic trio of circumstantial evidence that juries understood. He would paint a picture of a violent man with a history of abusing women, a man who had killed his wife in a rage and then attempted to cover up the crime. The question that occupied everyone's mind was whether Mary Jane Heaster would be called to testify about the ghost. Preston knew that such testimony was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it explained how the investigation had been reopened, how suspicions had been raised that led to the exhumation and autopsy. On the other hand, it risked making the prosecution look foolish, relying on supernatural evidence that educated people would dismiss as nonsense. Preston consulted with colleagues, with judges, with anyone whose opinion he valued. The consensus was divided. Some argued that the ghost testimony would undermine the case's credibility. Others insisted that it was central to the story and that leaving it out would create a gap in the narrative that the defense could exploit. In the end, Preston decided that if the defense opened the door by questioning how the case had come to be reopened, he would allow Mary Jane to testify about her daughter's visits, but he would not lead with that testimony. He would build the case on the solid foundation of physical evidence and circumstantial proof, and only if necessary would he venture into the realm of the supernatural. It was a calculated risk, but Preston believed it was the right approach. As spring arrived in Greenbrier County, the land began to thaw and green returned to the hills. Apple trees blossomed white and pink. Fields were ploughed and planted. Life continued its eternal cycle, indifferent to human tragedy and human justice. But in the county jail, Trout Shue sat in his cell, and at the Heaster farm Mary Jane tended her garden and prayed for the trial to bring the closure that her daughter's ghost had made possible. And in the cemetery at Soul Chapel, Zona's grave had been filled in again, the earth packed down tight, the headstone standing watch over a body that had already told its story and could now rest. Chapter 6. The Mother's Vigil. The months between Trout Shue's arrest and his trial were a strange limbo for Mary Jane Heaster. She had accomplished what she set out to do. Her daughter's murder had been discovered. The killer had been arrested. Justice, it seemed, was finally in motion. But the weight of what she had experienced did not lift. The ghost visits had ceased after the fourth night, but the memory of them remained vivid and unsettling. She had seen her daughter's spirit, had heard her voice from beyond death, had been given knowledge that no living person should possess. The experience had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand. She did not speak publicly about the visitations unless directly asked, and even then she chose her words carefully. She was aware that many people considered her mad or deluded. She had heard the whispers, seen the looks that passed between neighbours when they thought she was not watching. Some believed her story completely, accepting it as proof that God intervened in human affairs and that the dead could return when justice required it. Others thought she had experienced grief-induced hallucinations that happened to point her toward a truth she had already suspected. Still others dismissed the entire ghost narrative as a convenient fiction, suggesting that Mary Jane had always known or strongly suspected what had happened to Zona, and had simply used the ghost story to force an investigation that would not otherwise have occurred. Mary Jane did not argue with any of these interpretations. She knew what she had experienced. She had seen her daughter's luminous figure standing at the foot of her bed. She had heard Zona's voice describing the violence of her death. She had been given specific details about the murder that were later confirmed by the autopsy. Whether others believed her or not seemed almost beside the point. The truth had been revealed. That was what mattered. But the experience had exacted a toll. Mary Jane found that she could no longer sleep properly through the night. She would wake at the slightest sound, her heart racing, half expecting to see another ghost standing in the darkness of her room. She prayed constantly, not for more visitations, but for peace, for the strength to endure what lay ahead, for justice to be properly served at the trial. She visited Zona's grave regularly, bringing flowers in the spring and sitting on the ground beside the headstone, speaking to her daughter as though Zona could still hear her. Perhaps she could. Mary Jane no longer felt certain about the boundaries between the living and the dead. Jacob Heaster watched his wife with concern. He had always been a practical man, rooted in the physical world, skeptical of anything that could not be touched or measured or understood through common sense. The ghost story troubled him deeply, not because he thought his wife was lying, but because accepting it as true required him to revise his entire understanding of how the universe worked. He had been raised in a faith that taught about heaven and hell, about the soul's journey after death, but these were abstract concepts, comforting stories to make sense of mortality. The idea that the dead could return, could speak, could provide evidence in a murder investigation was altogether different and far more unsettling. Yet he could not deny what had happened. The investigation had been reopened based on Mary Jane's insistence. The exhumation had revealed exactly what she said her daughter's ghost had described. The physical evidence matched the supernatural testimony with a precision that seemed impossible to attribute to coincidence. Jacob found himself in the uncomfortable position of believing something he could not understand, accepting a truth that violated everything he thought he knew about the natural order. He dealt with this cognitive dissonance by focusing on the practical matters at hand, supporting his wife, maintaining the farm, and preparing for the trial that would determine whether Shue would pay for his crime. As spring progressed into early summer, the community's attention increasingly turned toward the upcoming trial. Louisburg, the county seat, began to prepare for what promised to be the most sensational legal proceeding in the region's history. The courthouse, a solid brick building that sat on the main square, would be the venue. Extra seating was arranged. Reporters from newspapers across the state requested accommodations. The trial was scheduled to last several days, and everyone expected that the courtroom would be packed with spectators eager to hear the evidence, and especially eager to hear whether the prosecution would dare to present testimony about a ghost. Prosecutor John Preston worked tirelessly to prepare his case. He interviewed and re-interviewed every potential witness. He studied the autopsy report until he could recite it from memory. He consulted with the physicians who had examined Zona's body, making sure they could explain their findings in language that a jury of farmers and shopkeepers would understand. He researched Shue's history, gathering evidence about the previous marriages, the violence, the pattern of behaviour that suggested this was not an isolated incident but the culmination of a lifetime of cruelty toward women. Preston also spent considerable time with Mary Jane Heaster, preparing her for the possibility that she would be called to testify. He explained to her that the defense might try to discredit her by focusing on the ghost story, painting her as an unreliable witness whose testimony should be disregarded. He coached her on how to present her experience in a way that emphasized faith rather than delusion, divine intervention rather than mental instability. Mary Jane listened carefully and assured him that she would tell the truth as she knew it, regardless of how others might perceive it. The truth, she said, had a power of its own, and those who were meant to hear it would recognize it when it was spoken. The defense attorney, Preston Hogg, faced a much more difficult task. His client was almost certainly guilty. The physical evidence was damning. The circumstantial evidence painted a clear picture of motive and opportunity. Trout Shue's history of violence toward women would be difficult to keep out of the trial, and even if Hogg succeeded in having some of it excluded, enough would likely remain to poison the jury against his client. Hogg's only real hope was to create reasonable doubt, to suggest alternative explanations, to attack the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, and to hope that the jury would be reluctant to convict a man of murder based on what might be perceived as a hasty or flawed investigation. Hogg met with Trout Shue regularly in the county jail, trying to construct a defense strategy from very limited materials. Trout remained largely uncommunicative, offering little help to his own cause. He would not explain what had happened the morning Zona died. He would not provide an alibi or suggest any other person who might have been responsible. He simply sat in his cell, sometimes staring at the wall, sometimes pacing like a caged animal, occasionally muttering things that Hogg could not quite make out. It was as though Trout had retreated to some interior space where the external world could not reach him, where consequences and judgments were abstractions that no longer had meaning. There was one topic that would sometimes animate Trout, and that was the ghost. When Hogg mentioned Mary Jane Heaster's claims about visitations from Zona's spirit, Trout would become agitated, even angry. He insisted that there was no ghost, that the whole story was a fabrication designed to turn people against him, that Mary Jane Heaster had manipulated the investigation through lies and hysteria. Hogg, sensing that this reaction could be useful, considered making the ghost testimony a central part of his defense strategy. If he could get Mary Jane on the stand and get her to describe the visitations in detail, he might be able to convince the jury that the entire case was built on the fantasies of a grief-stricken woman rather than solid evidence. It was a risky approach, but given the weakness of his position, Hogg felt he had little choice but to take risks. As the trial date approached, tension in Greenbrier County grew palpable. Families argued over dinner tables about Trout Shue's guilt or innocence, about whether ghosts were real, about what the trial would reveal. Churches held special prayer services, some praying for justice, others praying for mercy, still others praying simply for truth to prevail, whatever form it took. The local newspaper published daily updates about trial preparations, interviewing anyone connected to the case, and printing speculation about what might happen when the proceedings began. Mary Jane continued her vigil at Zona's grave, though she went early in the morning now before others were likely to be about, seeking privacy for her conversations with her daughter. She told Zona about the approaching trial, about her hope that justice would finally be served, about her fear that something might go wrong and Trout might escape punishment. She asked for strength to face what lay ahead, to testify if called upon, to endure whatever the defense attorney might say about her or her experiences. And sometimes, in the quiet of those morning visits, she thought she felt a presence, not visible but palpable, a sense that Zona was somehow still there, still listening, still concerned with the outcome of events in the world she had left behind. Jacob often accompanied his wife on these cemetery visits, standing at a distance to give her privacy but close enough to provide support if needed. He had learned not to question her need for these one-sided conversations. Grief took many forms, and if talking to a headstone brought Mary Jane some measure of peace, then he would support it without judgment. He no longer knew what to believe about the supernatural elements of the case, but he knew his wife, knew her character and her sanity, and he trusted that whatever she said she had experienced, she truly had experienced in some form that mattered. The last week before the trial, Mary Jane had a dream. It was not a visitation like the ones that had come in February, but it felt significant nonetheless. In the dream, she was standing in a courtroom, though it was not quite like any courtroom she had ever seen. The walls were made of light, and there were no people present except for Zona, who sat in the witness stand wearing her white wedding dress. Zona smiled at her mother and said, "Tell them the truth. They will believe what they need to believe." Then the dream shifted, and Mary Jane was standing at Zona's grave and flowers were growing up through the earth, covering the ground in a blanket of white and purple blooms. When she woke, Mary Jane felt a sense of calm that had eluded her for months. Whatever happened at the trial, she would do her duty. She would tell the truth. The rest was in God's hands. On the morning of June 2007, Mary Jane Heaster, dressed in her best mourning clothes, black dress with a simple collar, her hair pinned up beneath a black bonnet. Jacob hitched their wagon, and together they rode into Lewisburg, joining the stream of people converging on the courthouse for the first day of the trial. The sun was bright, the sky cloudless, and the June heat was already building, though it was not yet mid-morning. Mary Jane carried a small Bible that had belonged to Zona, holding it in her lap during the ride, her thumb marking a passage in Psalms that spoke of justice and truth. As the courthouse came into view, solid and imposing against the summer sky, Mary Jane closed her eyes and said a final prayer. Then she stepped down from the wagon, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the door where history was waiting to be made. Chapter 7. The visitations begin. The courtroom filled quickly on that June morning, every bench packed with spectators who had arrived early to secure their places. The air was thick with heat and anticipation, the windows thrown open in hopes of catching any breeze that might relieve the stifling atmosphere. Men fanned themselves with folded newspapers. Women wielded palmetto fans that had been distributed by a local merchant hoping to advertise his establishment. The judge's bench stood elevated at the front of the room, dark wood polished to a shine, flanked by the American flag and the flag of West Virginia. The jury box sat to the right, 12 chairs waiting for the men who would decide Trout Shue's fate. And at the defense table sat the accused himself, wearing a clean suit that someone had brought him from his house, his hair trimmed, his face freshly shaved, looking nothing like a monster but rather like any other man who might be seen walking down the street or working at his trade. Mary Jane and Jacob Heaster sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, positioned where they could see everything that transpired. Mary Jane's hands remained folded in her lap, her Bible resting beneath them, her face composed though her heart hammered in her chest. She had not seen Trout Shue since the day of Zona's funeral, and the sight of him now, sitting calmly as though he had nothing to fear, sent a wave of anger through her that she had to consciously suppress. She reminded herself that anger would not serve justice. Only truth would do that. Judge McWhorter entered, and everyone rose. He was an older man, grey-haired and dignified, known for running an orderly courtroom and tolerating no nonsense from either side. He took his seat, arranged his papers, and called the court to order. The bailiff announced the case, the state of West Virginia versus Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, charged with murder in the first degree. The words hung in the air, formal and terrible, transforming what everyone knew as a local tragedy into a matter of law. The jury selection took most of the morning. Prosecutor Preston and defense attorney Hogg questioned potential jurors about their knowledge of the case, their beliefs about circumstantial evidence, their ability to remain impartial despite what they might have heard or read in the newspapers. The ghost question hung over the proceedings, though neither attorney addressed it directly during selection. Preston wanted jurors who would not dismiss the case simply because its origins were unusual. Hogg wanted jurors who would be skeptical of evidence that could not be explained through normal rational means. By noon, 12 men had been chosen, farmers and tradesmen all, men who had known hard work and hard decisions, men whose faces revealed little of what they might be thinking. After a recess for dinner, the trial began in earnest. Prosecutor Preston rose to deliver his opening statement. He was a commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried to every corner of the room without shouting. He laid out the case methodically, describing Zona Heaster as a young woman who had made mistakes in her past but was trying to build a new life, who had married Erasmus Shue in good faith, hoping for happiness and security. He described the brief marriage, the isolation Zona experienced, the controlling behaviour witnesses had observed. Then he described the morning of January 23rd when Zona was found dead at the bottom of the stairs in her home, her husband conveniently absent, her body arranged in a way that suggested staging rather than accident. Preston spoke of the hasty examination by Dr. Knapp, the interference by Trout Shue, the suspicious scarf wrapped around Zona's neck. He described Mary Jane Heaster's conviction that something was wrong, her insistence that the death be investigated more thoroughly. He mentioned, briefly and without elaboration, that Mrs. Heaster had received information that led her to demand an exhumation, but he did not explain the source of that information. He would save that revelation for later, if it became necessary. Instead, he moved directly to the autopsy findings. The irrefutable physical evidence that Zona Heaster Shue had been strangled and her neck broken by human hands. He described the bruises, the fractured vertebrae, the crushed windpipe, painting a picture of violence and deliberate killing that made several women in the courtroom gasp and reach for their handkerchiefs. The evidence would show, Preston told the jury, that only one person had the opportunity to commit this murder. Only one person had tried to prevent a proper examination of the body. Only one person had a history of violence toward women, having been married twice before, with both marriages ending in death or divorce under suspicious circumstances. The evidence would show, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Erasmus Shue had murdered his wife in a fit of rage, had attempted to conceal the crime, and had nearly succeeded in escaping justice. It was the jury's duty, Preston concluded, to ensure that this man paid for his crime, that Zona Heaster Shue's death would not go unavenged, and that the truth would prevail no matter how skillfully the defence might try to obscure it. Defence attorney Hogg's opening statement was more cautious, as befitted a man playing a weak hand. He did not deny that Zona Shue had died of violence. The autopsy evidence was too clear to dispute, but he suggested that the investigation had been flawed from the beginning, contaminated by prejudice and rushed conclusions. He pointed out that no one had witnessed the alleged murder, that the prosecution's case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence and speculation. He reminded the jury that in America, a man was presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, and that reasonable doubt existed when the evidence was ambiguous or the investigation incomplete. Hogg hinted, without stating directly, that he would question the methods by which the investigation had been reopened. He spoke of grief and how it could affect judgment, how a mother's loss might lead her to see malice where there was only tragedy. He suggested that the jury should be sceptical of evidence obtained through means that were, he paused deliberately, unconventional. He did not use the word ghost, but everyone in the courtroom understood what he was implying. The defence would argue that the entire case was built on a foundation of hysteria and superstition rather than solid investigative work. When both opening statements were complete, Preston called his first witness. It was Andy Jones, now 12 years old, looking uncomfortable in clothes that were too formal and too warm for the June heat. The boy took the stand and was sworn in, his voice cracking slightly when he promised to tell the truth. Preston gently led him through his testimony, asking him to describe the morning he had been sent to fetch eggs from the Shue residence, what he had found when he entered the house, what he had done next. Andy spoke haltingly, clearly nervous, but his account was consistent with what he had told others on that terrible morning. He had found Mrs. Shue lying at the bottom of the stairs, not moving, cold to the touch when he had dared to briefly touch her hand before running for help. Hogg's cross-examination was brief and gentle. He did not want to appear to be bullying a child, which would turn the jury against him. He simply established that Andy had not witnessed any violence, had not seen anyone else in or around the house, had no knowledge of what had happened before he arrived. The boy was excused, visibly relieved to escape the attention of the crowded courtroom. The next witness was William Gibbons, the blacksmith who had accompanied Andy back to the shoe house. Gibbons testified about finding Trout there, about the husband's apparent grief, but also about the strange behaviour he'd observed. He described how Trout had held Zona's head, had kept adjusting her position, had seemed more concerned with arranging her than with understanding what had happened to her. He mentioned the scarf around her neck, how large and concealing it had been, how Trout had been defensive when anyone tried to touch it. Under cross-examination, Hogg got Gibbons to admit that grief could manifest in strange ways, that people in shock sometimes behaved oddly, and that nothing he had witnessed necessarily indicated guilt. Dr. Knapp took the stand in the afternoon, and his testimony was more damaging to the defence. Preston walked him through the events of that morning, getting him to admit that his examination had been inadequate, that Trout Shue had interfered, that he had signed a death certificate without being certain of the cause of death. Knapp's discomfort was visible, his professional reputation being dissected in public, but he answered honestly. He described the exhumation and autopsy, the findings that had made clear what he had missed in his initial examination. The bruising on Zona's neck, the broken vertebrae, the crushed windpipe, the unmistakable evidence of manual strangulation followed by a violent breaking of the neck. Hogg tried to shake Knapp's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that the passage of time and the conditions of burial might have created ambiguities in the autopsy findings, but Knapp held firm. The injuries he and his colleagues had documented were clear and unambiguous. They could not have been caused by a fall or any accident. They required human agency, deliberate force, murderous intent. Dr. Rupert testified next, providing even more detailed medical testimony about the autopsy. He brought diagrams showing the location of bruises and fractures. He explained in technical terms how the injuries would have been inflicted, demonstrating with his own hands on his own neck how someone standing behind Zona would have grabbed her, where the thumbs would have pressed, how the neck would have been twisted to cause the fractures found in her spine. Several jurors leaned forward, studying the diagrams, clearly trying to understand the mechanics of the murder. Hogg's cross-examination made little headway against this testimony. The science was clear, the evidence irrefutable. As the afternoon wore on and witness after witness provided pieces of the puzzle, the case against Trout Shue seemed overwhelming. But everyone in the courtroom knew that the most controversial testimony was yet to come. Preston had not yet called Mary Jane Heaster to the stand. He was building his case on solid evidence first, establishing the facts of the murder before addressing the unusual circumstances of how the investigation had been reopened. But the question hung in the air, unspoken but present in everyone's mind. Would he dare to bring up the ghost? Would the prosecution really ask a jury to consider testimony from beyond the grave? The first day of the trial ended with Judge McWhorter's instruction that the jury was to discuss the case with no one, was to avoid reading newspaper accounts, and was to return the next morning at 9 o'clock. The courtroom emptied slowly, people reluctant to leave, already discussing what they had heard, speculating about what would come next. Mary Jane and Jacob Heaster walked out into the evening heat, the sun still high in the summer sky. Mary Jane felt exhausted, drained by the hours of testimony, by the clinical descriptions of her daughter's death, by the necessity of hearing in precise medical terms what had been done to Zona. But she also felt a grim satisfaction. The truth was emerging. The evidence was clear. Surely the jury would see what was so obvious to her. That night, Mary Jane slept poorly, waking several times from dreams she could not quite remember, but that left her feeling unsettled. Each time she woke, she would lie in the darkness and pray, asking for strength, asking for justice, asking for the wisdom to speak well if she was called to testify. She did not know if Preston would put her on the stand. Part of her hoped he would not, that the physical evidence would be sufficient and she would not have to expose her most profound and personal experience to public scrutiny. But another part of her wanted to testify, wanted to tell the world what Zona had shown her, wanted to make sure that her daughter's voice, speaking from beyond death, would be heard in the place where justice was being weighed. Chapter 8. The Exhumation. The second day of the trial began with testimony from Zona's neighbours, women who had known her during the brief months of her marriage to Trout Shue. These witnesses painted a picture of a young wife who had become increasingly isolated and fearful as the weeks passed. Martha Cantrell testified that she had visited Zona in early January and found her nervous and distracted, jumping at small sounds, apologising excessively for trivial things. When Martha had asked if everything was well, Zona had started to answer, but then stopped herself, glancing toward the door as though expecting someone to enter. She had changed the subject, asking about Martha's children, deflecting attention away from her own situation. Sarah Harrer, another neighbour, testified that she had heard shouting coming from the Shue residence on multiple occasions in the weeks before Zona's death. She could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A man's voice raised in anger, loud enough to carry across the distance between houses. Once, she had heard what sounded like breaking crockery, a crash followed by silence. She had considered going to check on Zona, but had talked herself out of it, believing that what happened between husband and wife was private business, and that interfering might make things worse. Now, sitting in the witness stand, Sarah's regret was visible on her face. Perhaps if she had acted, if someone had intervened, Zona might still be alive. Hogg's cross-examination of these witnesses focused on the ambiguity of their observations. Raised voices did not prove violence. Nervousness might have many causes. Neither woman had actually witnessed Trout Shue striking his wife or threatening her. Their testimony was suggestive but not conclusive. Hogg was careful to be respectful, not wanting to appear to be dismissing the witnesses' concerns, but he needed to establish that suspicion and proof were not the same thing. Preston then called a witness who would testify about Trout Shue's previous marriages. Ali Estelline Cutlip, now remarried and going by a different name, had travelled from her home in another county to testify. She was a small woman, perhaps 40 years old, with a hardness around her eyes that suggested she had seen difficult things and survived them. She testified that she had been married to Trout Shue for 3 years in the late 1880s, that the marriage had been a nightmare of jealousy and violence, and that she had finally divorced him after he had beaten her so severely that she feared the next beating would kill her. Ali described how Trout's jealousy had been irrational and consuming. He had accused her of infidelity without cause, had forbidden her to speak to other men, had monitored her movements constantly. When she displeased him, which happened frequently and unpredictably, he would fly into rages, throwing furniture, breaking dishes, and eventually turning his violence on her. She showed the jury a scar on her forearm where he had once grabbed her with such force that his fingernails had torn her flesh. She testified that she had loved him at first, that he could be charming when he chose, but that she had eventually come to understand that beneath the charm was something dangerous and unstable. Hogg objected strenuously to this testimony, arguing that whatever had happened in a previous marriage was not relevant to the present case, that the prosecution was trying to prejudice the jury against his client by introducing inflammatory material that had nothing to do with Zona Shue's death. Judge McWhorter overruled the objection, stating that evidence of prior similar acts was admissible to show pattern and character. The jury would hear about Trout Shue's history, and they would draw their own conclusions about what that history suggested about his capacity for violence. The morning wore on with more witnesses establishing the timeline of events, the discovery of the body, the initial investigation and its shortcomings. Preston was building his case brick by brick, each piece of testimony adding to the weight of evidence against Trout Shue. By midday, he had established that Zona had died violently, that Trout was the only person with opportunity to commit the murder, that he had a history of violence toward women, and that he had engaged in suspicious behaviour designed to conceal evidence of his crime. After the dinner recess, Preston called the witness everyone had been waiting for. Mary Jane Heaster rose from her seat and walked to the witness stand with deliberate steps, her back straight, her face calm despite the terror churning in her stomach. She was sworn in, promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help her God. She said the words clearly, meeting the judge's eyes, then turned to face Preston and the courtroom beyond him. Preston began gently, establishing Mary Jane's identity, her relationship to the victim, her knowledge of Zona's marriage to Trout Shue. He asked about her concerns regarding the marriage, her attempts to visit her daughter, the obstacles Trout had placed in the way of those visits. Mary Jane answered each question carefully, her voice steady, providing facts without editorializing. She described the day she had learned of Zona's death, her immediate conviction that something was wrong, her observations at the funeral of the elaborate scarf around her daughter's neck, and the strange way Trout had guarded the body. Then Preston asked the question that made the entire courtroom seem to hold its breath. How had she come to insist on an exhumation and autopsy? What information had led her to demand that the investigation be reopened? Mary Jane paused, closing her eyes briefly as though gathering strength. When she opened them, she looked directly at the jury and began to speak. She told them about her prayers, about kneeling beside her bed every night for weeks, asking God to reveal the truth about her daughter's death. She told them that on the night of February 18th, 4 weeks after Zona's burial, her prayers had been answered. Her daughter had appeared to her in the night, standing at the foot of her bed, glowing with a soft light that came from no earthly source. The courtroom was absolutely silent. No one coughed or shifted in their seats. Every eye was fixed on Mary Jane Heaster as she described the visitations. Zona had appeared not once but 4 times, she testified, each visit lasting longer than the one before. The ghost had described her murder in terrible detail. She had told her mother how Trout had become enraged over some trivial matter, how he had grabbed her from behind, how his hands had closed around her throat with crushing force. She had described the moment when her neck had been broken, a sensation she said was like lightning and darkness happening simultaneously. She had told her mother about the scarf Trout had used to hide the evidence, about the careful staging of her body at the bottom of the stairs. Mary Jane testified that the ghost had given her specific information that she could not have known otherwise. Zona had told her that the neck was broken on the right side, that it would be found to have been twisted almost completely around if the physicians examined it carefully. She had described bruises that would be in the pattern of Trout's fingers. She had spoken with the authority of someone who knew exactly what had happened, because she had experienced it, because she had been there, because she was the victim speaking from beyond the grave. When Mary Jane finished her testimony, Preston thanked her and sat down. The silence in the courtroom continued for several moments, as though everyone was processing what they had just heard. Then Hogg rose for cross-examination, and the mood shifted. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the opportunity to discredit the prosecution's case by exposing its foundation as supernatural nonsense. Hogg began by asking Mary Jane about her state of mind in the weeks after Zona's death. Had she been sleeping well? Had she been under tremendous stress? Had she been taking any medicines or tonics that might affect her perceptions? Mary Jane answered calmly that she had been grieving, as any mother would, but that her mind had been clear. She had not been taking any substances. She had not been ill or feverish. She had been praying, and God had answered her prayers by allowing her daughter to return. Hogg pressed harder. Had she actually seen a physical body, or had it been more like a dream? Could she distinguish between what she saw with her eyes and what she might have imagined in her grief? Mary Jane remained composed. She had seen her daughter as clearly as she was seeing Hogg now. The figure had been luminous, transparent perhaps, but visible and real. The voice had been Zona's voice, unmistakable to a mother who had heard it since birth. Hogg asked whether anyone else had witnessed these visitations. Mary Jane admitted that her husband had been asleep during the encounters, that she had been alone each time. Hogg seized on this, suggesting that what she had experienced were grief-induced hallucinations, vivid dreams that her mind had constructed to cope with the loss of her daughter. Mary Jane disagreed quietly but firmly. These had not been dreams. She knew the difference between sleeping and waking, between imagination and reality. The cross-examination continued for more than an hour, Hogg trying every approach he could think of to undermine Mary Jane's credibility. He suggested that she had already suspected Trout and had created the ghost story to force an investigation. He implied that she was emotionally unstable. He questioned whether a rational person could truly believe that the dead returned to speak to the living. Mary Jane met each attack with calm dignity, never becoming defensive or angry, simply restating what she had experienced and maintaining that the ghost had been real. Finally, Hogg made a tactical error. Frustrated by his inability to shake Mary Jane's testimony, he asked sarcastically whether she expected the jury to believe that ghosts were real, that the supernatural could provide evidence in a court of law, that justice should be based on visions and phantoms rather than facts and reason. Mary Jane looked at him steadily and replied that she did not need the jury to believe in ghosts. The ghost had led to the exhumation, and the exhumation had revealed the physical evidence that proved murder. The jury could dismiss her visitations as fantasy if they wished. The autopsy findings would remain true regardless. It was a perfect answer, turning Hogg's attack back on itself. The ghost testimony was not the foundation of the case, but rather the catalyst that had uncovered the real evidence. Whether one believed in the supernatural or not, the physical facts spoke for themselves. Zona had been murdered, and the evidence that proved it had been found because a mother had refused to accept the initial ruling and had demanded a thorough investigation. Hogg had no effective response. He ended his cross-examination and sat down, looking deflated. Preston had no redirect questions. Mary Jane was excused from the witness stand. She walked back to her seat beside Jacob, her legs trembling slightly now that the ordeal was over. But her head held high. She had told the truth. She had given her testimony. Whatever the jury chose to do with it was beyond her control. The rest of the afternoon was taken up with closing witnesses and technical details. Preston was clearly winding down his case, having presented all the essential evidence. The medical testimony was unassailable. The circumstantial evidence was strong. And the ghost testimony, whatever one thought of it, had at least provided a compelling narrative for how the investigation had been reopened. By the time Judge McWhorter adjourned for the day, it seemed clear that the prosecution had made its case effectively. That night, the town of Lewisburg buzzed with conversation about Mary Jane's testimony. In taverns and parlours, at dinner tables and on front porches, people debated what they had heard. Some found her account credible and moving, evidence that God worked in mysterious ways to ensure that evil did not go unpunished. Others dismissed it as the delusions of a grieving mother who had happened to stumble onto the truth through lucky guesswork. Still others were unsure what to believe, caught between their rational skepticism and their spiritual faith, uncertain whether the universe allowed for such things as returning ghosts. Mary Jane herself spent the evening in prayer, thanking God that her testimony was complete, asking for wisdom for the jury, praying for peace for Zona's spirit. She felt lighter now, as though she had discharged a heavy burden by speaking publicly about the visitations. Whether others believed her or not seemed less important than it had before. She had done what Zona had asked her to do. She had told the truth. The rest was in hands larger than her own. Chapter 9. The Trial of Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue. The third day of the trial opened with the defence's presentation. Preston Hogg had a difficult task ahead of him. His client had not given him much to work with, and the evidence against Trout Shue was overwhelming. But Hogg was a competent attorney, and he would do his duty to provide the best defense possible within the constraints he faced. His strategy would be to cast doubt on the investigation's thoroughness, to suggest alternative explanations where possible, and to paint Trout as a grieving husband rather than a murderer. Hogg's first witness was a character witness, a man who had worked alongside Trout at the blacksmith shop and who testified that Trout had been a good worker, reliable and skilled, friendly with customers, showing no signs of the violent temperament the prosecution had described. Under cross-examination, Preston got the witness to admit that he had known Trout for only a few months, had never seen him at home with his wife, and had no knowledge of what Trout might be like behind closed doors. Several other character witnesses followed, neighbours and acquaintances who testified that Trout had seemed devoted to Zona, that they had never witnessed any violence or heard any arguments. Their testimony was sincere but ultimately ineffective. The absence of publicly witnessed violence did not mean violence had not occurred. Indeed, as Preston pointed out during his cross-examinations, the most dangerous domestic violence often happened in private, hidden from neighbours and friends, revealed only when it was too late. Hogg then called a physician, a doctor from another county who had not been involved in the autopsy, but whom Hogg hoped might raise questions about the medical evidence. This doctor testified that interpreting the injuries after a body had been buried for a month could be challenging. That decomposition and the effects of burial might create ambiguities in determining exactly how and when injuries occurred. But under Preston's withering cross-examination, the doctor admitted that he had not examined Zona's body himself, that he was speaking only in theoretical terms, and that the specific injuries documented in this case, particularly the broken neck and crushed windpipe, could not plausibly be explained as anything other than deliberate violence. By midday, it was clear that the defence was making little headway. Hogg's witnesses had not effectively countered the prosecution's case. The physical evidence remained damning. The circumstantial evidence still pointed inexorably toward Trout Shue as the killer. Hogg's final strategic decision was whether to put Trout himself on the stand. It was a gamble. If Trout could present himself as a sympathetic figure, if he could explain away the suspicious elements of his behaviour, if he could express his grief convincingly, he might create enough doubt to save himself. But if he came across as cold or evasive, or if Preston managed to break him under cross-examination, his testimony could seal his fate. After a consultation with his client during the dinner recess, Hogg made his decision. Trout would testify, it was his only real chance, and Hogg believed that Trout, if properly coached, could be convincing. When court reconvened, Hogg called Erasmus, Stribling Trout Shue to the stand. Trout walked to the witness box with measured steps, his face carefully composed. He was sworn in and took his seat, folding his hands in his lap, looking out at the crowded courtroom with an expression that seemed to combine sorrow and dignity. Hogg began with gentle questions, establishing the basic facts of Trout's life, his work as a blacksmith, his previous marriages, which he explained as tragedies he had suffered. His first marriage had ended in divorce, he said, because of incompatibilities he and his wife had been too young to recognise before they wed. His second wife had died of natural causes, a sudden illness that the doctors could not prevent. He spoke of these losses with apparent pain, painting himself as a man who had known more than his share of heartbreak even before meeting Zona. When asked about his courtship of Zona, Trout's voice took on a warmer tone. He described meeting her, being struck by her beauty and gentle nature, wanting to give her the security and love she deserved. He spoke of their wedding day as one of the happiest of his life, of his hopes for their future together. He testified that he had loved his wife deeply, that their marriage had been happy despite what some witnesses had suggested, that any arguments they might have had were the normal disagreements of any couple learning to live together. Hogg asked about the morning of January 23rd. Trout took a deep breath and described leaving home early that morning to run errands in town, kissing Zona goodbye, telling her he would be back by midday. When he returned, he found the door open and the neighbour boy's tracks on the porch. He entered to find his wife lying at the bottom of the stairs, clearly dead. He described his shock and grief, how he had cradled her in his arms, how he could not believe she was gone. He explained the scarf around her neck by saying that Zona had always been self-conscious about a birthmark on her throat, that she habitually wore high collars and scarves to conceal it, that even in death he had wanted to respect her wishes about her appearance. When asked about his behaviour during the examination and funeral preparations, Trout maintained that his actions had been motivated solely by grief and a desire to preserve his wife's dignity. He had not been trying to conceal evidence. He had simply been protective of the woman he loved, not wanting strangers to handle her roughly or treat her as merely an object to be examined. He admitted that his judgment might have been clouded by emotion, that perhaps he should have allowed the doctor to conduct a more thorough examination, but at the time he had not been thinking clearly. Hogg's direct examination lasted nearly 2 hours, carefully constructing an alternative narrative in which Trout was not a murderer but a grieving husband, Not a man with something to hide, but a man overwhelmed by loss. When Hogg finished and sat down, there was a sense in the courtroom that Trout had presented himself well, that he had been calm and sympathetic, that perhaps there was reasonable doubt after all. Then Preston rose for cross-examination, and the careful edifice Hogg had built began to crumble. Preston started slowly, asking Trout to confirm details from his direct testimony, establishing a baseline before moving in for more aggressive questioning. Then he shifted topics abruptly. Why, Preston asked, had Trout insisted on such a quick funeral? Why had he resisted allowing proper examination of the body? Why had he changed Zona's clothes himself, rather than allowing the women of the community to perform that traditional service? Trout's answers became less smooth. He repeated that he had been grieving, that he had not been thinking clearly, that his only concern had been for his wife's dignity. Preston pressed harder. Was it not true that Trout had been married twice before, and that both marriages had ended badly? Was it not true that his first wife had divorced him citing cruelty? Was it not true that his second wife's death had occurred under circumstances that were never fully explained? Trout became defensive. His previous marriages had nothing to do with Zona's death. Preston was trying to prejudice the jury against him by bringing up irrelevant history. Judge McWhorter sustained some of Hogg's objections to this line of questioning, but enough had been established to plant doubt in the jury's minds about Trout's character. Preston then moved to the evening before Zona's death. What exactly had happened that night? Had there been an argument? Trout insisted there had been no argument, that the evening had been peaceful, that he and Zona had eaten supper and gone to bed. Preston produced a witness statement from a neighbour who claimed to have heard raised voices from the Shue house that evening. Trout said the neighbour was mistaken or lying. The cross-examination became more pointed. Preston asked about Trout's temper. Had he ever lost his temper with Zona? Had he ever raised his hand to her? Trout denied it vehemently. Preston asked why, if the marriage had been so happy, Zona had seemed fearful and isolated in the weeks before her death. Trout said she had been adjusting to married life, that she was naturally shy, that Preston was twisting innocent facts to create a false picture. Then Preston asked the question that broke Trout's composure. He asked Trout to explain how Zona could have broken her neck falling down the stairs when the autopsy had shown that the fracture was inconsistent with a fall, when the bruising on her throat showed clear finger marks, when every piece of physical evidence pointed not to accident but to deliberate violence. How did Trout explain those facts? Trout's face flushed. His carefully maintained composure slipped. He said that he could not explain the medical findings, that perhaps the doctors were mistaken, that bodies changed after burial, that the autopsy might have been flawed. Preston asked if Trout was suggesting that 3 physicians had all misinterpreted the evidence. Trout said he did not know, that he only knew he had not killed his wife. Preston's final question was devastating in its simplicity. If Trout had not killed Zona, then who had? Was he suggesting that some intruder had entered their home, strangled his wife, broken her neck, then carefully arranged her body and left without taking anything or leaving any trace? Was that what the jury was being asked to believe? Trout had no good answer. He stammered that he did not know what had happened, that it was not his responsibility to solve the crime, that the prosecution was supposed to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt and they had not done so. But his lack of any plausible alternative explanation, combined with the anger that had seeped into his voice as the cross-examination proceeded, had damaged his credibility severely. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, the sympathy he had generated during direct examination had largely evaporated. Hogg called no more witnesses. He had played his best card by putting Trout on the stand, and it had not been enough. The defence rested, and Judge McWhorter announced that closing arguments would be heard the following morning, after which the case would go to the jury. That night, Trout sat in his cell, finally beginning to understand that he might actually be convicted. He had believed, or had convinced himself to believe, that his performance on the stand would save him, that his grief and his denials would be enough to create doubt. but Preston's cross-examination had exposed the weaknesses in his story, had revealed the absence of any credible explanation for the physical evidence. For the first time since his arrest, Trout allowed himself to contemplate what would happen if the jury returned a guilty verdict. West Virginia had the death penalty. Murder in the first degree was a capital crime. He could hang for what he had done to Zona. Mary Jane Heaster spent that night in a different kind of anticipation. She felt that justice was within reach, that the trial had gone as well as could be hoped, that the evidence against Trout was overwhelming. But she also knew that juries were unpredictable, that 12 men might see things differently than she saw them, that reasonable doubt was a high standard, and the defence had tried hard to create it. She prayed not for vengeance, but for justice, for the truth to be recognised and acted upon, for Zona's death to be properly answered by the law that was supposed to protect people like her daughter. The next morning, the courtroom filled even earlier than usual, people knowing that this would be the final day, that by evening a verdict might be reached. The summer heat was oppressive. The air thick and still despite the open windows. Judge McWhorter took his seat and called for closing arguments. Preston went first, as the prosecution had the burden of proof, and therefore the right to speak both first and last. Preston's closing argument was methodical and powerful. He reviewed the evidence piece by piece, building the case against Trout Shue with the patience of a mason laying bricks. The physical evidence proved murder. The circumstantial evidence pointed to Trout as the killer. The suspicious behaviour showed consciousness of guilt. The history of violence toward women established pattern and character. Preston spoke for nearly 2 hours, his voice never faltering, his logic relentless. He concluded by reminding the jury that Zona Heaster Shue had been a young woman whose only crime had been trusting the wrong man, and that justice demanded they hold that man accountable for taking her life. Hogg's closing argument was shorter and more emotional. He appealed to the jury's sense of fairness, reminding them that circumstantial evidence could be misleading, that grief could make people behave strangely, that the burden was on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. He attacked the ghost testimony as the product of a grief-stricken mind, though he was careful not to disparage Mary Jane Heaster directly, knowing that would alienate the jury. He suggested that the rush to judgment in this case had prevented proper investigation of alternative explanations. He asked the jury to carefully consider whether the prosecution had truly met its burden or whether doubt remained. Preston's rebuttal was brief and sharp. He pointed out that the defence had offered no alternative explanation for Zona's injuries, no theory of the case that fit the facts, no evidence that contradicted the prosecution's narrative. He reminded the jury that reasonable doubt meant doubt based on reason, not on wishful thinking or sympathy for the defendant. The evidence in this case left no room for reasonable doubt. Zona had been murdered, and her murderer sat at the defence table. Judge McWhorter then instructed the jury on the law. He explained the elements of first-degree murder, the meaning of reasonable doubt, the weight they should give to different types of evidence. He told them that they could consider Trout's testimony and demeanour, the credibility of all witnesses, the physical evidence, and what it proved. He instructed them that if they found Trout guilty of first-degree murder, they could recommend mercy, which would result in a life sentence rather than death, or they could remain silent on the question of punishment, which would leave that decision to the court. The jury retired to deliberate at 11 o'clock in the morning. The courtroom slowly emptied as people went to find dinner and to wait. Mary Jane and Jacob remained in their seats, neither hungry nor willing to leave even for a few moments. The waiting was almost unbearable, time stretching out in strange ways, minutes feeling like hours. Mary Jane held her Bible and prayed silently. Jacob sat beside her, his weathered hand covering hers, offering what comfort he could through simple presence. The jury deliberated through the afternoon. As the hours passed, some observers began to wonder if they were deadlocked, if perhaps 1 or 2 jurors were holding out against conviction. But at 4:30 in the afternoon, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The bailiff rang the bell to summon everyone back to the courtroom. Within minutes, the room was packed again, every seat filled, people standing along the walls. The jury filed back into their box, their faces revealing nothing. Trout stood to hear the verdict, Hogg beside him. Mary Jane gripped Jacob's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Judge McWhorter asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreman, a farmer named Samuel Miller, stood and said they had. The clerk asked him to state the verdict. Miller looked directly at Trout Shue and spoke clearly so that everyone in the courtroom could hear. Guilty of murder in the first degree, the jury recommended mercy. Collective exhales swept through the courtroom. Mary Jane closed her eyes and felt tears streaming down her face. Tears of relief and sorrow mixed together. Justice achieved, but her daughter still gone. The verdict right, but unable to undo what had been done. Trout Shue stood motionless for a moment. Then his knees buckled and Hogg had to support him to keep him from falling. Judge McWhorter thanked the jury for their service and set a date for sentencing 2 weeks hence. The trial was over. Trout Shue would spend the rest of his life in prison. Chapter 10. The Verdict and the Silence. After. The sentencing hearing took place on July the 10th, 1897, in the same courtroom where the trial had unfolded 2 weeks earlier. The summer heat had intensified, and even in the morning hours the air inside the courthouse hung heavy and still. The crowd was smaller than it had been during the trial, the sensation seekers having moved on to other entertainments, leaving behind only those with a direct connection to the case or a genuine need to see it through to its conclusion. Mary Jane and Jacob Heaster sat in their customary place, both dressed in black as they had been every day since Zona's death. Mary Jane's face showed the exhaustion of months of grief and struggle, but there was also something like peace in her expression, a sense that the long battle was finally ending. Trout Shue was brought into the courtroom in chains, precaution that had not been necessary during the trial, but which reflected his new status as a convicted murderer. He had aged visibly in the 2 weeks since the verdict, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He had been held in solitary confinement at the county jail, partly for his own protection, as word had spread that some citizens were making threats about taking justice into their own hands if the legal system failed. But the legal system had not failed. The jury had spoken. Now only the formality of sentencing remained. Judge McWhorter entered and took his seat. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge asked if the defendant had anything to say before sentence was pronounced. Preston Hogg stood and indicated that his client wished to make a statement. Trout rose slowly, his chains rattling, and faced the judge. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, and those in the back of the courtroom had to strain to hear. Trout said that he had loved his wife, that he had never intended for any harm to come to her, that what had happened that morning in January had been an accident born of passion and anger that he could not control. He did not admit to murder explicitly, but the words were as close to a confession as he would ever come. He spoke of his temper, of how it had plagued him all his life, of how in moments of rage he became someone he did not recognize. He said that Zona had done nothing to deserve what happened, that she had been innocent and kind, and that he would carry the weight of her death for whatever remained of his days. When he finished, he sat down heavily, as though the effort of speaking had exhausted him completely. Judge McWhorter listened without expression. When Trout finished, the judge consulted the papers before him, then looked up at the defendant with eyes that held no sympathy. He spoke of the sanctity of marriage, of how a husband's duty was to protect and cherish his wife, not to harm her. He spoke of the violence that had been done to Zona Heaster Shue, of the terror she must have felt in her final moments, of the deliberate cruelty involved in strangling another human being and then breaking their neck to ensure death. He spoke of the elaborate deception that had followed, the attempt to hide the crime, the abuse of a community's trust. The jury's recommendation of mercy meant that Trout would not hang, the judge continued, though some might argue that death would be a more appropriate punishment for such a crime. Instead, Trout would spend the remainder of his natural life imprisoned at the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville. He would never again walk free. He would never again have the opportunity to harm another woman. He would have decades, if he lived that long, to contemplate what he had done and to make whatever peace he could with his maker. Judge McWhorter pronounced the sentence formally. Life imprisonment at hard labour to commence immediately. Trout was to be transported to Moundsville within the week. The case of the state of West Virginia versus Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue was now concluded. The judge struck his gavel once, a sound like a door closing, and it was finished. The guards led Trout from the courtroom. He did not look back at the spectators, did not seek out any familiar face. He walked with his head down, his chain scraping against the wooden floor, disappearing through the door that led to the cells below. Mary Jane watched him go, and felt nothing like triumph, only a profound weariness and a wish that none of it had ever happened, that her daughter could be restored to life, that the past 6 months could be erased like words on a slate. But time moved in only one direction, and what was done could not be undone. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Mary Jane and Jacob, asking for statements, seeking reactions to the sentence. Mary Jane spoke briefly, her words measured and quiet. She said that justice had been served, that she was grateful to Prosecutor Preston and to the jury for their careful consideration of the evidence, and that she hoped her daughter could now rest in peace. She did not speak of the ghost unless directly asked, and when she did mention the visitations, she framed them as a matter of faith, as God's mercy allowing truth to be revealed. The reporters wrote down her words and hurried off to file their stories, and Mary Jane and Jacob climbed into their wagon for the journey home. The ride back to the farm took them past Saul Chapel Cemetery. Mary Jane asked Jacob to stop, and together they walked up the hill to Zona's grave. The headstone was simple, bearing only her name, the dates of her birth and death, and the words, "Beloved daughter." The earth had settled over the grave since the exhumation, grass beginning to grow again in the disturbed soil. Mary Jane knelt beside the stone and placed her hand on the ground, feeling the warmth of the summer sun on her palm, imagining it reaching down through the earth to where her daughter lay. She spoke aloud, though quietly, telling Zona that it was over, that Trout had been convicted and sentenced, that justice had been achieved. She thanked her daughter for coming back, for having the courage to return from beyond death to speak the truth. She promised that she would tend this grave for as long as she lived, that Zona would not be forgotten, that her story would be remembered. Then she stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt, and walked back down the hill with Jacob, leaving Zona to the silence and the summer wind. The trial of Erasmus Shue became famous throughout West Virginia and beyond, making its way into legal textbooks and collections of unusual cases. It was cited in courtrooms and law schools as the only known case in American legal history where testimony about a ghost visitation had been admitted into evidence and had played a role, however indirect, in securing a murder conviction. Legal scholars debated whether the ghost testimony should have been allowed, whether it violated principles of rational jurisprudence, whether it set a dangerous precedent. But others argued that the testimony had merely explained how the investigation was reopened and that the actual conviction had rested entirely on physical evidence that would have been compelling with or without any supernatural elements. Trout Shue was transported to Moundsville Penitentiary in mid-July of 1897. The prison was a massive stone fortress on the banks of the Ohio River, designed to hold the worst criminals in the state. Trout was processed into the general population, given a number and a cell, his previous identity stripped away. He would work in the prison workshops during the day, making brooms or shoes or whatever labour was assigned to him. He would eat in the common dining hall and sleep in his narrow cell and count the years as they accumulated into decades. Prison records show that Trout was not a model prisoner. He fought with other inmates, spent time in solitary confinement for infractions of prison rules, and developed a reputation as a difficult and volatile man. He never spoke publicly about Zona's murder after his sentencing statement. He received few visitors, and those who did come reported that he seemed to have retreated into himself, responding to questions with monosyllables or silence. His previous wives, when contacted by curiosity seekers or reporters, refused to discuss him, wanting only to be left alone to live their lives free from association with his crimes. Mary Jane Heaster lived for another 19 years after the trial, dying in 16 at the age of 71. In those years, she became something of a local legend, the woman whose daughter's ghost had solved her own murder. People would sometimes come to the farm seeking to hear the story from her own lips, and she would accommodate them when she felt strong enough, though she grew weary of repeating the tale and of being treated as a curiosity. She continued to attend church regularly, to tend her garden, to live the quiet life of a country woman who had seen more than most people see, and who carried that knowledge with a dignity that those who knew her found remarkable. Jacob Heaster died in 1913, 3 years before his wife, after a brief illness. Mary Jane tended him through his final days with the same devotion she had shown throughout their marriage. After his death, she lived alone on the farm with the help of her remaining children, who had scattered to various parts of the state but who visited regularly and made sure she was cared for. She spent her final years reading her Bible, working in her garden, and making frequent visits to Zona's grave, where she would sit for long periods in silence, perhaps communing with her daughter in ways that those who observed could not understand. When Mary Jane died in 1916, she was buried beside Zona in Soul Chapel Cemetery, her own headstone placed next to her daughter's. The two graves sit together on that hillside overlooking the valley where both women had lived their lives. Over the decades, the story of the Greenbrier ghost became part of local folklore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. The graves became a minor tourist attraction, visited by those interested in ghost stories or legal history, or simply by the strange and tragic nature of the case. Erasmus Stribling Shue died in prison on March 13, 1900, just 3 years into his life sentence. The official cause of death was listed as complications from measles and pneumonia, an epidemic having swept through the prison that winter. He was 43 years old. His body was claimed by a distant relative and buried in an unmarked grave in a small cemetery near Moundsville. No one mourned him publicly. No stone marked his resting place. He vanished from the world as completely as his crimes had briefly made him infamous, leaving behind only the records of the trial and the memory of what he had done. The house where Zona died stood empty for some years after the trial. No one wanted to live in a place where such violence had occurred, and there were whispers that it was haunted, that Zona's ghost walked there still, trapped between worlds by the trauma of her death. Eventually the house was torn down, and the land returned to fields and forest. Today, nothing marks the spot where Zona Heaster Shue spent the last months of her life, and where she met her violent end. The road that once passed by the house is now barely a trace, overgrown with trees and brambles, reclaimed by the land. But in Greenbrier County, the story persists. Parents tell it to their children as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting too quickly, about the violence that can hide beneath a charming surface. Students of West Virginia history study it as a unique intersection of folk belief and legal process, of faith and reason, of the supernatural and the judicial. And those who believe in such things say that on certain nights, particularly in January when the anniversary of Zona's death approaches, a figure in white can sometimes be seen on the hillside near Soul Chapel, standing at a grave as though keeping watch, as though some vigil continues beyond death and beyond justice. The case of the Greenbrier ghost stands as testimony to several truths. It demonstrates that murder will out, that even the most carefully concealed crimes can be discovered when those who love the victim refuse to accept convenient lies. It shows that faith, whether one shares it or not, can be a powerful motivator for seeking justice. It reveals the capacity of the legal system to adapt to unusual circumstances while maintaining its commitment to physical evidence and rational process. And it reminds us that the dead, in whatever form they speak, sometimes refuse to be silenced. The evening light falls gently now across the hills of Greenbrier County, much as it did on that January day in 1807 when Zona Heaster Shue drew her last breath. The seasons turn and the mountains endure. New generations are born and live their lives and pass away as all generations must. But some stories persist, carried forward not because they are sensational, but because they touch something deep in human experience, some understanding that justice matters, that truth matters, that love can transcend even death when it needs to speak. Mary Jane Heaster heard her daughter's voice from beyond the grave and acted on what she heard, demanding investigation when others wanted to close the case and move on. Whether one believes her experience was literal or metaphorical, divine intervention or grief-induced conviction, the result was the same. A murder was discovered. A killer was convicted. Justice, imperfect as human justice always is, was served. And a mother's love proved stronger than death, stronger than deception, stronger than the silence that murder tries to impose on its victims. The candles have burned low. The night has grown deep. The story, like all stories, must come to an end. In Greenbrier County, in the quiet cemetery on the hillside, 2 headstones stand side by side, mother and daughter reunited in death as they were briefly reunited across the boundary between worlds. The wind moves through the grass. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, and history, having told this tale, turns the page in the dark, moving on to the next story, the next tragedy, the next mystery that time will eventually reveal. The dead rest. The living remember. And the truth once spoken echoes down through the years, waiting for those who have ears to hear it.